On the 13th of September 1944, the lead tank of an American armored column rolled into the German border town of Roetgen and stopped dead. Ahead of it, the road ran straight into a belt of concrete pyramids, row behind row, each one squatting in the wet ground like a tooth. On the left of the road, the shoulder fell away into a gully. On the right stood more of the teeth. And in the road itself, where the only gap through them should have been, the retreating Germans had blown a crater wide enough to drop a Sherman into. If you were the tank commander at the head of that column, you were looking at the thing every crew on the Western Front had been warned about. The dragon's teeth of the West Wall. Reinforced concrete, set in 4 and 5 rows, built for one job, to stop a tank at exactly the spot where you are now stopped. Your column weighed hundreds of tons. It could do nothing. Could not climb the teeth. There was no shoving through them. It could not slip around them into the gully or the pillbox fire waiting on the far side. The gun in your turret, which could punch a hole in a German tank a mile off, was worthless against a field of concrete lumps that did not move and did not shoot back. So the answer did not come from the tanks at all. It came from the men who climbed down off them and walked forward on foot, out in front of all that armor, carrying demolition charges and Bangalore torpedoes, and the nerve to work in the open until a lane opened. The combat engineer, with a satchel of explosive and an armored bulldozer behind him, was the weapon that beat the dragon's teeth. This is the story of how a wall that stopped an army was cracked open by a handful of men on foot, and how the tanks finally rolled through into Germany. Stay with it, and you will watch the lane open tooth by tooth. The West Wall came first. The reversal only means something once you see how good the German defense was. The West Wall was not a rumor. The Germans began it in 1936, poured by the organization TOT, and by the time American troops reached it, the belts ran for about 390 miles down the western border of the Reich, from the Dutch frontier to Switzerland. Inside that belt sat roughly 20,000 structures. Boxes, manned bunkers, shelters, gun positions dug into reverse slopes, and threaded between them, wherever tanks might come, the anti-tank obstacle the Germans called the Hacker Hindernis, the hump obstacle. Every American soldier who saw it called it the dragon's teeth. Teeth were not loose blocks. Along a chosen line, the Germans laid a single continuous slab of reinforced concrete, a foundation that ran unbroken for hundreds of yards. They sank that foundation 3 to 6 feet into the earth, deep enough that no attacker could tunnel under a section and lift it out with a charge. On top of the slab, they cast the teeth themselves, pyramids of reinforced concrete in 4 and 5 staggered rows. The front row stood about 3 to 4 feet high. Each row behind it stood taller than the one in front, so the whole field sloped up and back like a set of stairs built for something that would never climb them. That shape was the whole idea, and it was cold and it was clever. A tank driver who tried to force the belt would nose his hull up onto the low front teeth. The tracks would climb, the nose would rise, and the belly of the tank, its thinnest armor, would tip up toward the sky. Then the taller rows behind would catch the hull. The tank hung there. Its tracks clawed at concrete and found no grip. The floor was exposed. It was going nowhere. A machine built to move faster than a man now sat still in the open, and every German anti-tank gun and every pillbox on the far side had been laid in advance to cover that exact strip of ground. The teeth did not have to destroy a tank. They only had to hold it in one place for the 30 seconds it took a gunner in a bunker to do it. And the teeth did more than stomp. They channeled. A commander could not breach concrete on a whim, so tanks were funneled toward the few roads that crossed the line, and the Germans knew every one of those roads to the yard. They cratered them, blocked them with steel gates, and pointed their guns down them. The dragon's teeth turned the whole approach into a maze with 1 or 2 doorways, and every doorway was a trap. There were men in that concrete, waiting. American intelligence built a picture of the West Wall garrison out of prisoner interrogations, and it was not comforting. Each pillbox held at least 17 men, many of them former Luftwaffe ground crew handed a rifle and a fixed position, and each box carried about 2 weeks of food, so a garrison could button up and keep fighting long after it was cut off. In front of the concrete, the Germans strung barbed wire, sowed mines, and set trip flares to catch a man crawling up in the dark. The pillboxes themselves sat on forward slopes, most of them 200 to 400 yards back from the teeth. That distance was not an accident. It was the range at which the teeth stalled a tank, and the guns in the boxes could work it over at leisure. The boxes did not fight alone either. An American officer who studied the line described the pillboxes as sighted in clusters, all intersupporting and laid to cover each other by fire. Reduce one, and the boxes on either side would fire on the men who had just taken it. The one soft spot he found was that there was almost always one box in a group that could be knocked out first. That box, once reduced, permitted his men to start a circuit, a foothold from which they could roll up the rest one at a time. Getting that first box was the whole problem, because to reach it the infantry had to cross the open ground the teeth had funneled them into. Reduced was a polite word for a hard job. Post-battle study of the line found that artillery firing from behind the front could pin a garrison inside its box and grind down its nerve, and sometimes that alone was enough to bring a shaken crew out with their hands raised. But to actually crack the reinforced concrete took something much heavier. The Americans concluded that only the 155mm gun or the 8-inch howitzer could punch through a good pillbox wall, and only after 3 to 5 direct hits. Anything lighter marked the concrete grey and warned the men inside that company was coming. Nothing in the American armored infantry answered it. A Sherman could not drive over the belt. It could not push the teeth aside because each one was anchored to that buried slab and would not budge. Field artillery could shell the line for a week and chip the concrete grey, and the teeth would still be standing, still doing their job. You cannot make a gap in a wall by firing at the whole wall. Somebody had to get down among the teeth at arm's length and take them apart one section at a time. And the only ground troops who could cross that belt were the men with no armor at all, the infantry and the engineers walking. That was the gap in the American plan in September of 1944, and it was a real one. First Army was moving fast that month. The Germans had been driven back across France, the border was in reach, and Courtney Hodges wanted the West Wall bounced before the enemy could man it in strength, because the clock was the real stake. In September, the wall was thinly held, its garrisons a patchwork of tired units and rear area men scraped together after the long retreat. Every day the Americans spent stalled at the concrete was a day the Germans used to feed fresh troops into it. By late in the year they had reactivated the line in earnest, manning more than 600 of its major works with infantry and Volksgrenadier divisions. Teeth were dangerous with a weak garrison behind them. With a strong one, they would be far worse. Breaking through in September, while the door was only half shut, was worth the price the engineers were about to pay. But speed is an armored idea, and the Dragon's teeth were built to make armor slow. When the lead columns rolled up to the concrete, the tanks stopped, and the whole weight of an armored division piled up behind them on a handful of roads. A division that measured its advances in miles a day was suddenly measuring them in yards, and the yards were being paid for by men on foot. The army had tried to invent a shortcut. One of them was the demolition snake, a long steel tube packed with explosive, some of them running out to 400 feet, meant to be pushed up to an obstacle and fired to blow a clean lane. On paper, it was the answer. In the field, it fouled, broke apart, and would not track where it was aimed, and the crews learned quickly that it could not be trusted with the lives that depended on the lane it was supposed to cut. The shortcut did not exist. What existed was the combat engineer and the tools he could carry or drive. On the 3rd Armored Division's front, these were the men of the 23rd Armored Engineer Battalion, the division's own engineers, who had come ashore at Omaha Beach on the 23rd of June and fought the length of France to reach this concrete. They rode with the tanks, and when the tanks stopped at the teeth, it was their job to climb down and get them moving again. So look at the weapon that actually beat the wall, because it was a weapon, even if it fit in a canvas bag. The heart of it was the demolition charge, blocks of TNT the engineers packed by hand against the concrete. A pole charge was exactly what it sounds like, an explosive charge lashed to the end of a pole so a man could shove it against a pillbox embrasure or wedge it into a joint in the teeth without standing directly over it. A satchel charge was the same idea in a bag, slung and dropped where it was needed. For the belts of barbed wire the Germans strung in front of the concrete, the engineers carried the Bangalore torpedo, a length of pipe filled with explosive that you pushed under the wire and fired to blow a path an infantryman could run through. None of these things looked like a war winner. Every one of them was in the right hands against the right target. But explosive alone did not open a lane wide enough for a tank. When American engineers cracked the Dragon's teeth, they rarely blew a tidy doorway at the base of the concrete and drove through it. What they did was messier, and it worked better. They used charges to shatter and loosen the teeth, to break the tops off and crack them loose from the slab. Then they brought up the machine that finished the job, the armored bulldozer. A tank fitted with a blade, or a plain dozer with armor bolted around the driver, would push earth and broken concrete up over the teeth. The whole belt disappeared under a ramp of dirt, a graded slope the tanks could climb and cross. Where the Germans had cut an anti-tank ditch, the same blade shoved the spoil back in and filled it. The engineers did not remove the wall. They buried it and drove over the top of it. And to keep the German gunners off the men doing the work, the Americans brought a gun forward that most armies kept far to the rear. It was the M12, a self-propelled gun that bolted a 155mm barrel, a heavy piece of an older generation, onto the chassis of a medium tank so the whole thing could drive itself right up to the front. The 258th Field Artillery Battalion rolled these guns up to the line. Instead of firing from behind a hill, they laid the barrel over open sights, straight at a pillbox, at ranges where the crew could see the very embrasure they were aiming into. A pillbox that had shrugged off a week of high-angle shellfire had a different day when a 155mm shell arrived flat and level through the firing slit. It took 3 to 5 direct hits to crack the reinforced concrete of a good bunker, and the big gun sat there and fired until it got them. That was the covering fire that let a man kneel among the teeth with a charge in his hands. The pillbox behind the teeth fell to the same engineers and infantry, working a drill they sharpened box by box. One team put small arms fire on the embrasure to blind the gunners and keep their heads down. Under that fire, an assault team worked around the flank to the blind rear of the box, where the single steel door was, and there a man could shove a pole charge against the door or feed a satchel of explosive against the wall. When the charge went, the fight inside was usually finished, and if the garrison did not come out, a second charge or a tank round through the doorway settled it. It was slow. It was done at arm's length, and it worked. Where the teeth had funneled the infantry into a beaten zone, this was how they climbed out of it, one reduced box at a time, exactly the circuit the intelligence officer had described. It all came together on one road at Roetgen, on a single September morning, and the wall came apart. The town was Roetgen, the date the 13th of September, and the unit was Task Force Lovelady, built around the 2nd Battalion of the 33rd Armored Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division. Lieutenant Colonel William Lovelady's column had already done something no American had done, pushed a spearhead of the 3rd Armored clear through the outer band of the West Wall, and become the first American armor over the German border in strength. Then, just short of the pillbox line at Roetgen, the road ran out into the Dragon's Teeth, with the gully on one side and more teeth on the other, and that blown crater sitting in the one gap a tank might have used. The first instinct was the fast one. Fill the crater and drive on. The engineers threw dirt into the hole, and the dirt, in ground already soaked, turned to muck that a tank would only sink into. So there was no fast way. There was only the slow one. Under the eyes of the pillboxes, the engineers went to work on the teeth themselves, placing their charges, firing them, clearing the broken concrete, grading a path the armor could take. It ate the whole morning. Not until late in the day did the lead tanks finally grind up over the shattered teeth and past the crater and roll on north. It's my one road. Man belt. Half a day of men working in the open to buy it. South of there, near a village called Ober Forstbach, a second column ran into a harder version of the same problem, and it shows you both how the method worked and what it cost when it did not. This was Task Force Doan of the 3rd Armored's Combat Command, under Brigadier General Doyle Hickey. Doan's tanks came up against a cluster of pillboxes fronted by an unbroken row of dragon's teeth, and when the engineers moved forward to blast a gap, German mortar fire came down on them and drove them off the concrete. You cannot place a charge by hand while mortar rounds are walking across the ground you are kneeling on. The teeth held because the men who could open them could not reach them. What saved the attack was not a weapon, but a farmer. At one point along the belt, local farmers had at some earlier time built up a crossing of stone and packed earth over the teeth, a rough fill so they could get carts across their own fields. That fill was a ready-made ramp, and Doan's men found it and used it. The lead vehicle onto it was a Scorpion, a flail tank meant to beat mines out of the ground. Its weight drove it down into the soft earth of the fill until it bogged and sat there, one vehicle plugging the single crossing the task force had. For a while, the whole attack hung on that stuck machine. It was recovered under fire by a crew led by a sergeant named Sverri Dahl, hauled clear so the column could move. German guns caught the tanks as they crossed the exposed fill and knocked out 4 of them, unable to maneuver on the narrow lane. But the column got across. The pillbox line behind the teeth was turned, and Combat Command A was through. That is the shape of the reversal, and it repeated wherever the tanks met the teeth. The wall stopped nothing for long once the engineers reached it. What it cost was the time and the men spent getting them there. Follow Task Force Lovelady past Roetgen, and you see how fast the story turned once the belt was open. The morning was spent on a few hundred yards of concrete. The afternoon of the following day, the 14th, Lovelady's column ran more than 4 miles across rolling farm country against nothing heavier than scattered mortar and small arms fire, and reached the Vict River by nightfall. By the 15th, the task force had driven clean through the Schill Line, the thicker rear band of the west wall near Mausbach. The deepest, strongest belt of the whole 390 miles was behind them in 3 days. The teeth had promised to hold an army. Once the men on foot cracked the first lane, the army poured through the hole and did not stop. The same lesson was written again a few weeks later, farther north, on a larger scale. In early October, the 19th Corps set out to break the west wall on the Worm River near Aachen, with the 30th Infantry Division leading and the 2nd Armored Division waiting behind it to exploit. On the 2nd of October, a rolling barrage from hundreds of guns and mortars came down on the line, and the infantry of the 117th Regiment stormed across the Worm on footbridges the engineers threw over in minutes. That first day, the 117th reduced 11 pillboxes with no armor beside them, at a cost of 227 casualties. They closed on each bunker the hard way. Small arms fire through the embrasure, while assault teams worked around to the rear door with charges. Where the dragon's teeth ran across the corridor, the engineers blasted and buried them the same way, and the covering 155mm guns cracked the pillboxes with direct fire. On the 3rd of October, the 2nd Armored Division crossed the Worm and took the town of Ubach, armor pouring through a wall that had been called proof against it. It was not a clean or a cheap breach. The 119th Regiment, pushing through denser forest on the southern flank, took roughly twice the casualties of the 117th for the same few miles of concrete. As the fighting wore on, the Germans threw in hard counterattacks that clawed back ground in places and had to be beaten off before the line steadied. The garrison of the West Wall did exactly what it had been left there to do, which was to make the Americans pay by the yard. What it could not do was hold once the engineers had opened lanes for the armor, because a defense with no way to plug the gaps is a defense on a clock. By the 16th, the two arms of the attack met northeast of Aachen and closed a ring around the city. The West Wall in that sector, the strongest fixed line the Reich had built in the West, had been breached in 2 weeks. The post-war verdict of the men who studied it was blunt. The dragon's teeth, once combat engineers with explosives and dozers went to work on them, proved far less of an obstacle than almost anyone had expected before the fighting. Teeth were a magnificent piece of engineering, and against the weapon that beat them, they were mostly a delay. They were built to stop the tank, and they did every time, until the man on foot walked up to them with a charge in one hand and a bulldozer at his back. The concrete never moved and never surrendered. Did not have to. The engineers did not argue with the wall. They shattered the top off it, buried the rest under a ramp of its own broken pieces, and drove the whole 3rd Armored Division over the grave of the thing that was supposed to have stopped it. So the payoff was never a bigger tank or a heavier shell. It was a private with a pole charge and a satchel of TNT, a sergeant hauling a bogged flail tank out of a farmer's fill under mortar fire, a dozer driver grading a slope over concrete pyramids while pillboxes watched him do it. The dragon's teeth of the West Wall stopped tanks cold, exactly as designed. Combat engineers, on foot and in the open, blew the gaps and buried the rest, and the armor rolled through into Germany. If you served on those crews, I want to hear it. Did you ever set a demolition charge, ride a dozer tank, or walk a Bangalore up under the wire while everyone waited on you to open the lane? If your father or grandfather was a combat engineer in the drive to the West Wall, put his unit in the comments so the rest of us can look for him in the record. And tell me which pairing you want next, a German fortress or line that stopped an army cold, and the American weapon that cracked it open. Name it below. And if this one was worth your time, subscribe, because there is a lot of concrete left to break.